This line graph shows a steep 60% surge in the consumption of true crime media in the United States between 2020 and 2021, highlighting a massive cultural appetite for dramatized stories about serial killers. Online aestheticization and media framing often mold these cold-blooded offenders into charismatic antiheroes, leaning heavily into an inherent human fascination with tragedy and danger. The production of these hit shows rarely involves the victims' families. Major streaming platforms routinely develop and broadcast heavily dramatized series without asking for consent from the people who actually lived through the horrors depicted on screen. Relatives of Jeffrey Dahmer's victims have been forced to speak out. People like Eric Perry and Rita Isbell watched as their darkest family traumas were suddenly laid bare for public consumption and corporate profit, describing the experience as re-traumatizing over and over again. To understand the reality of the Milwaukee murders, we have to look past the Hollywood fixation on a fascinating villain. Consuming this tragedy as pure entertainment risks repeating the exact same systemic marginalization that allowed the killer to operate in the first place. During the 1992 trial, the defense team attempted to plead insanity. The strategy relied on establishing narrative distance between the gruesome reality of 15 murders and the jury, painting a picture of a thoroughly uncontrollable, fractured mind. This timeline tracks the killer's actions alongside his multiple psychological evaluations. The prosecution presented evidence that he was evaluated and deemed legally sane. He fully comprehended the moral and legal wrongfulness of his acts, taking deliberate, rational steps to hide his crimes. Looking closely at these highlighted gaps between the murders, a clear pattern emerges. These intervals represent weeks and months of meticulous planning and evidence destruction. He was a hedonic serial murderer, a killer motivated by the pursuit of pure pleasure and control, who calculated his every move. He operated his lethal routine from 1978 to 1991 in densely populated urban environments. A sane, methodical killer regularly luring victims to his apartment should have triggered law enforcement scrutiny much earlier. His ability to evade detection for 13 years came from an entirely different source. He recognized the deep-seated prejudices and blind spots of the society around him, and he used them to his advantage. The Milwaukee Police Department in the 1980s and early 90s operated with severe, documented patterns of racial bias and homophobia. Complaints generated from specific, marginalized neighborhoods were consistently undervalued. The 17 men and boys targeted between 1978 and 1991 were overwhelmingly impoverished, young men of color, and many were part of the LGBTQ+ community. Their identities made them highly vulnerable to a predator who knew the authorities were unlikely to prioritize their disappearances. At the Oxford Apartments on North 25th Street, neighbors frequently reported disturbing behavior, physical struggles, and foul odors. Law enforcement repeatedly dismissed the concerns of the residents, allowing the atrocities to continue unchecked in an ordinary residential building. The cost of that negligence peaked on a night in May 1991. 14-year-old Connor Synthesomphone managed to escape the apartment. He was found naked, bleeding, and heavily drugged, stumbling down the street. 2 black female bystanders saw the boy and immediately recognized that he was in critical danger. They called the police and desperately pleaded with the arriving officers to protect him. The officers chose to ignore the women's warnings. Instead, they listened to the white killer, who arrived on the sidewalk and falsely claimed the child was his adult partner and that they were simply having a lover's quarrel. The police walked the boy right back into the apartment. The officers left without checking an ID or running a background check. Deep-seated homophobia and racial bias blinded law enforcement to the reality in front of them, directly granting a killer the impunity to continue taking lives. When authorities finally arrested him in July 1991, the inside of apartment 213 was a gruesome discovery. The preserved evidence and remains stood as a physical manifestation of a city's total failure to protect its most vulnerable residents. The revelation sparked massive public protests against police negligence. At the trial, relatives expressed sheer agony over a system that had reduced their brothers, sons, and cousins to mere numbers, demanding that the victims be treated with respect. Today, the media industry commits a similar violation. When true crime podcasts and shows fabricate a victim's final thoughts or actions to create narrative drama, they exploit real suffering to generate audience retention. Real change requires a new standard for true crime media. Studios must mandate family consent before production begins, and directors need to reject casting conventionally attractive actors in ways that romanticize violent offenders. As viewers, we choose what succeeds. We can demand content that remembers individuals like Stephen Hicks and Anthony Hughes as complex people whose lives had value, rather than treating them as disposable plot devices. True justice requires stripping the glamorous spotlight away from the villain and turning it instead onto the systemic biases we must dismantle and the human lives we must honor.